welcome to our webinar today. We have a special guest, Rishabh Jain from LiveRamp, who we'll be talking about ethical advertising in the world of CCPA and CPRA. Rishabh, just so you know, this is the functional equivalent of sitting somewhat awkwardly on a podium until folks walk into the room. So give us a few minutes for our attendees to join, and then we'll jump right in.
Sounds great.
And we'll have a terrific discussion today on a wide variety of subjects, um, including just what targeted advertising is, um, how it's done, how you can think about doing that ethically, and how companies can actually think of operationalizing some of the requirements so that you can actually do what you need to do, but do it ethically. And as I said, we have a few minutes as folks will join, um, and then we'll go from there. And I think some of the folks who are listed as panelists, you might need to turn off your video because you're being broadcast to everybody. Awesome. Well, Rishabh, if it's okay with you, I know we'll have folks joining throughout the session today. First of all, welcome to our panel today and to our discussion. I really appreciate you joining. This issue of ethical advertising, ethical marketing, has become a huge one for most companies in the last couple of years. When you're sitting, and in our community, Rishabh, on the WireWheel side, we're often talking to not only folks who are handling privacy, we talk to folks who are in the marketing world, we talk to the engineering teams, and you see so many companies trying to think about, okay, how do we think about advertising, targeted advertising, marketing, and use of consumer data, but to do it the right way. Um, and then on top of it, we've had laws passed in California, the CCPA, the CPRA, which are imposing new legal requirements on so many of us. So it's going to be a great conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. But we almost always like to just start with, tell us a little bit about yourself, tell us about your background, and how you got to what you're doing at LiveRamp.
Yeah, no, and thanks for having me, Justin. Really excited about this conversation. We've talked a lot about the interesting opportunities that these new legal requirements bring to marketers and advertisers, getting more innovative and actually in the process increasing the trust that they have with their consumers. So I'm really excited about this conversation. For me personally, I actually started my career as a scientist in physics, and actually towards the end of my career as a scientist, the thing that I got really interested in was in data sharing. And at that time, it was in the context of laboratory data sharing. And as I sort of looked to see what is the right next step for me personally, the world of ad tech, of course, was quite interesting when it comes to data sharing, and is exactly one of the main topics that we're going to be talking about today. And so I started working at LiveRamp, and currently I'm responsible for what we call our innovation and new business teams, amongst which LiveRamp is investing in actual privacy tools for marketers. So we acquired a company roughly a year and a half ago called Factor out of the Netherlands, which is now LiveRamp's consent management platform. And so that's one of the ways that more recently we're trying to help advertisers and marketers with thinking about the ethical use of their data and ethical advertising and marketing through this consent management platform. But as you were alluding to, I think that's just one of the ways that marketers and advertisers need to think about how they actually work with data ethically. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity right now for using privacy as a strategy, like I said, to increase trust with consumers, as opposed to viewing it as simply compliance. So that's a really quick background about me and why I'm excited about this conversation.
All right. You have to at least tell us what kind of physics were you doing before that uh, data sharing and targeted advertising was more interesting. Yeah. What were you studying?
You know, I was studying condensed matter physics, so basically solar energy physics. Yeah, and somehow the data sharing aspect of doing the research was more appealing to me at that time than the actual science. So here we are.
All right, we'll take it. Well, let's talk about some terms, Rashab. Just we often have folks joining from a lot of different backgrounds, and I think it's almost always helpful to just talk about some of the and define what we're talking about so that we can get on the same page. So let's start with well, how about a simple this? Why don't we talk a little bit about what LiveRamp
Yeah.
does, and then we'll talk about the concepts of targeted advertising and retargeting so that we all understand what that is and how it works.
Yeah, so LiveRamp is essentially an identity platform. So we play in the middle of the advertising technology ecosystem. I think the simplest use case that we enable is essentially if a marketer wants to do offline to online targeting. So imagine you're a Gap or a Macy's and you have your loyalty database and you want to find those users that you have in your loyalty database in the online world. So in your loyalty database, they show up as Justin Antonipillai or Rishabh Jain. In the online world, there's some cookie, right? So it's cookie ID 123. So we help with that translation from the offline user to the online user, and then within the online ecosystem. The thing that's really interesting that I think we've tried to pay a lot of attention to is making sure that when you're doing this identity translation, you're doing it anonymously, because what you don't want to do is re-identify anybody. So once it goes into our systems, it becomes an anonymous user. So we no longer know the source of that data or who that person is. We just know, okay, this person happened to buy a shirt and now happen to go to this website. So that's the role that LiveRamp plays right now. And when we think about the advertising concepts, so when we think about targeting and retargeting, the way that we often interact with that is the targeting concept is essentially saying something like, I want to find all of my loyalty users, right? That's a particular group of users that you're trying to find online. And so you create a segment and you target those users. And it could be for the reason of, Black Friday is coming up. I want my loyalty users to have a special deal that I want to offer them. Or retargeting, where somebody who comes into the store or lands on your website and you want to actually find them again because either they did not complete a purchase or they completed a purchase that you believe there is a useful upsell opportunity with them. So I go to the Gap store, I buy a shirt. Okay, if this person buys a shirt, maybe they also want to buy pants. Zoom world aside, typically that's what an advertiser would seek to do. And we're then trying to help that advertiser with that type of a use case. So we play this role of helping them translate on the identity space, but doing so in an anonymous way. So that way we're not revealing what's often called personal information or personally identifiable information.
Well, look, that helps. And let's start by just saying so targeting and retargeting. What's the difference? Let's start with that, and then I'll go
Mhm.
through a couple of other concepts, and maybe we can go through a crisp use case so that we're on the same page.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So typically when people are talking about targeting, what they are thinking about is a particular cohort of users that they are trying to find online. So if we use that same Gap example, the concept of targeting is that the advertiser or marketer knows beforehand what group of users they want to find. So they can say something like, I want to find the group of users who are loyalty users, or I want to find all men in San Francisco, as an example, right? And that's the sort of most simplistic way to think about targeting is you're defining a cohort and then you're trying to find the people who belong to that cohort. Retargeting tends to be that user has actually already interacted with you in some way. So they've come to your website or, and in the online world, it's really mostly they've come to your website. And then that brand then shows you an ad after you have left that property is typically how retargeting works, right? So when you think about, okay, I went to the Gap website and now I'm on the New York Times, and that Gap ad seems to be following me around the internet, that's typically what retargeting is they have identified your browser and they've identified, okay, the person using this browser is interested in Gap products. Let's make sure that we stay top of mind for them soon after they have come to our website. So that's typically how we think about the difference between targeting and retargeting.
Okay, that's helpful. So the now we get to now we get to some of the concepts that have been bothering people around the world, or at least you see it fairly often. So, you end up talking to your family members and they'll say, I did a search and then suddenly the ads start popping on my feed, or I've been to a website and then suddenly all of the ads are on some social media platform. And people, you can tell, are getting less comfortable with that, Rishabh.
Yep.
So before we get into the depths of it, how do you think about the movement here where, and this is tied up to what you and I have talked about before, and is kind of a broader movement around this idea of third party cookie tracking and how that works with people around the world. So now that we've talked a little bit about targeting and retargeting, uh, maybe if you could give a little bit of an explanation of, for viewers out there, or community, how does it actually work that somebody gets targeted and retargeted, and what is the role of a third party cookie right now?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think that right now, the way that this tends to be implemented is if I go, we'll use our Gap and Macy's example. If I go to Gap or Macy's, they will have an ad tech company that they work with. So, the most popular is somebody like a Criteo, right? So Criteo is a third party. It's not Gap and it's not Macy's. And so Criteo is the one who is pixeling the page and is dropping what's called a cookie. So it's basically a really short uh, document or amount of code. It's a way to identify that particular browser. So I'm on my Chrome browser, and now Criteo can read that short document, that cookie, no matter what website I'm on, right? So once I leave Gap's property and I go to the New York Times property, Criteo is still running on the New York Times. And so they can read their cookie and they can say, hey, this is the same person over here. So on behalf of Gap, I am going to show this ad to Rishabh again, right? And so the interesting thing for folks to think about is it's really important to think about what it means to be a third party cookie as opposed to a first party cookie, right? The reason for the distinction is Criteo, you never went to Criteo's website, right? So if you think about the flow of information here, you went to Gap's website, and Gap has a partnership relationship with Criteo, who, as the third party, is cooking the browser. And then similarly, they have a relationship with the New York Times. And so I think there tends to be two things that most consumers that you know I have learned from have taught me is one is that it feels like a lot of things are happening in the background that they don't really understand or have control over, right? And in this instance, it is the case that the third party is actually doing it in the background. You never went to Creative's website. And then the second thing is that once, if and when they learn about it, they want to understand, can I turn it off, right? And in some cases, they want to understand, actually, can I make it better, right? So I sometimes hear people laugh about, I already bought this good. Why am I getting advertised for it? I would much rather see something else. So I have actually heard it both ways, which I think is a signal that what users really want is they want to be able to understand it, right? They want to be able to understand it and control it, not necessarily to just turn it off entirely.
No, I look, I think that's important. Understanding it and really understanding it when it comes to advertising, targeted advertising, retargeting. This for colleagues of mine that work in the MarTech world, the general thing I hear, Rishabh, is as a practical matter, when you get into that world, you're functioning at a high school level for the first 6 months. You may be functioning at a operational level for the next 6 months, but it takes a full year to get up to speed and really understand how all of it works, including the bidding and the advertising process that goes behind it. So you kind of do need a PhD in physics to be able to get this at some level, right? So even making it simple for people to understand the difference between a first party cookie and a third party cookie and an authenticated relationship and how it works, it's hard even when you study it. And the idea that you can surface that to a human being who's surfing 80 different websites, an hour is very hard to do, right? In a
Yeah,
reasonable way.
yeah,
So now I'm going to lay over this even a little bit more complexity, but also some of the legal requirements, because now you get into what does the CCPA and what do CPRA talk about? So these are CCPA is the existing California law. CPRA is the law that just passed a couple of weeks ago. They sometimes call it CCPA 2.0. And one of the main things that both of these laws provide is the ability for a consumer to effectively opt out of. In CCPA, it was called opting out of the sale of your data. In CPRA, it gives consumers the ability to effectively not have their data transferred to a third party for purposes of retargeting, pretty much exactly in this way that we've discussed through that relationship. And for us, we see as you head into the holiday season, more and more companies who rely on targeting and retargeting as part of their core marketing. First of all, you see brands every
yeah,
day that know that they want to be on the leading edge of doing the right thing. Just forget about what the legal requirements are.
yeah,
Most brands know how important it is to build trust with your customers and your potential customers. And the idea that you might be doing your advertising or targeted advertising in a way that doesn't feel right is rising very high on the list of priorities for companies. And that burden often then falls to the marketing team. So forget about the law. We've seen that a lot where I just want to make sure I'm doing the right thing. Now you have this core requirement. You have to post, assuming you're covered by CCPA. And the way we look at it is, I don't know a company in the country that doesn't want to market or target to Californians. I mean, that's a very strange go to market if you are advertising to the entire country, but you're not going after Californians, right? So we end up in this situation where a company now, okay, number one, has to put something on their website where a consumer can easily say, please don't sell my data. And when they do that, a company needs to be able to stop retargeting that person using a third party platform. That's pretty clear at this point, which means a lot of the machinery you've talked about that works in real time, you have to stop from happening as soon as you know that's the person has told you not to sell my data. So, examples of this: if when somebody visits your site, pixel fires to a third party platform saying, hey, start advertising to whoever that is, you have to stop that from happening. And many of the platforms, and we've seen Facebook talk about this as well, Rashab, have put out technical solutions that enable a company to say, this is the person you shouldn't retarget, and then go ahead and retarget other people. So there's a little bit of machinery that we see developing, but it's not present everywhere, to put it simply. So if I were to lay it out, stepping back, the simple things we're seeing are, it's pretty clear now. You need to say and give a clear path for somebody to tell you, do not sell my personal information. If somebody says that, you as a brand or as a company need to stop retargeting them, you know, until
Yep.
you have a way to do it. And then you can ethically maybe target or retarget other folks. And there's some machinery you need in place to be able to handle that, both the taking of the preference and then engineering it. We WireWheel, for every disclosure, we work a lot with LiveRamp on putting that machinery in place so that it works the right way. But what are you seeing, from the marketing world in terms of
Yeah.
people becoming aware of just how much you have to put in place? And how are you all thinking about the movement here on being able to continue to market and advertise to folks consistent with these new legal requirements, Rashad?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. So I think that going back to what you started with around some companies really took it upon themselves to have this sort of ethical interaction with the consumer be a part of their strategy. So there were some, I will call them bleeding edge companies who, when GDPR happened, actually they took a step back and asked themselves, what do we want to be doing globally? Right. So they started to see that, hey, there is this ask from consumers that is then getting pushed into legislation to actually be able to control their data. And so there are some companies that at that time, now this is of course the minority, but there are some bleeding edge companies that at that time actually took a global view on how they wanted to set up to essentially be what they called GDPR everywhere. So, 2 years ago, there was a few companies that really started thinking about this concept of GDPR everywhere. Once CCPA happened, as you were talking about, what we started to notice is this question of do not sell. There were a lot of questions about what does it mean to sell data, right? And the passing of CPRA or CCPA 2.0 helped clarify for people that these types of use cases that advertisers and marketers are using does actually fall under, do not sell, right? It's now pretty clear that at a minimum, it will be required once CCPA 2.0 CPRA goes into effect. And so what we are starting to hear from publishers and brands is that they want to take the opportunity to be able to configure the right interaction with their consumer. So what does that mean? Essentially, what started off as, a large-ish number of companies saying, okay, I'm going to worry about compliance for now, and then I will think about what is the full scope of what I need to do later. Now what's starting to happen is people are starting to say, okay, it's pretty clear that this trend is here to stay. Help me implement a configurable way that I can set up the right interaction with my consumer. So that means they want to show the consumer how the data is being used in a way in which helps the consumer understand, hey, this is how we do our business, and this is helpful to us so that way we can continue to serve you in the best possible way. So one of the best examples that I have seen of, trying to design this ethical and strategic consumer interaction, funnily enough, is a weather website. So there's a weather website in Europe where they actually use, an image of a sunny day for allowing them to actually use your data and send it downstream, and then a rainy day for not allowing them to use your data and send it downstream, right? And so they try to help the consumer understand in a way that is brand consistent, it's a weather website, how the use of their data is going to help the brand and help the brand set up the right engagement with the consumer. Because one of the things that we talked about is it's not obvious that actually consumers simply want to block the sending of that data, right? And this is where, again, in disclosure, tools like WireWheel's tools and some of LiveRamp's tools can help. It's the case typically that the consumer wants to be able to understand what their data is being used for, so that way they can say okay to it. And then when they see something following them around, it's it's clear to them why something is following them around or why they're seeing a certain ad, because they were informed by the brand that this is what is going to happen. And designing that experience is the thing that I think we're starting to hear, brands and publishers ask for advice and seek input on what are the best ways to do that in order to make sure that they can continue to maintain a trusted relationship with the consumer. So, you know, it has been a change over time, basically since GDPR, and now it's really cementing with the passing of CPRA. But I think this is the trend that we're seeing.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, that's helpful. So I'll ask you a question so you can think about this, and then I'll add a little color, Rishabh. Um, without naming companies, are there practices you're seeing where folks are doing it the wrong way, but they may not know it, like that actually aren't sending the right signal? Because when we look at the high level takeaway, what do you actually need to do? There's some pretty clear low hanging fruit.
Yeah.
It needs to be very clear on your website exactly what you're collecting, who you're sharing it with, and for what purpose. Um, we're, a subcategory of that is because there's so much information to show, we're seeing trends for companies in a trust center that might have an area that says, here's everything you need to know, but here's what you really need to know, just so that people can pay attention to the most important information. There's always risk in that. You can tell no matter what you do, if you're trying to choose among the information, one can say, well, why did you highlight this and why did you not highlight this? But there's a good faith effort in a lot of the companies we're seeing of like, look, we have to try to highlight something because otherwise you're just showing too much information. It's very clear at this moment that if you just have a do not sell or a subject access experience and it's send an email and we'll take care of it, you're probably not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And understanding that next year, California is going to be imposing an actual data protection regulator and an audit requirement. We just look for ways that companies can actually make sure you can show that you're taking a do not sell request and actually doing something with it, that you're actually stopping certain practices and that you can show it. And we do see consumers starting to say, I said, do not sell my data. And then I started getting an ad. Like, why did that happen? I don't think there's total awareness of that issue. I really don't. I think people still feel like they don't know what's going on. But our view is over the next couple of years, that is going to be the kind of thing that gets companies in trouble. So maybe I'll come back having given you a little bit of time there. What are the kinds of practices you're seeing that companies may not realize
Yeah.
may get them in trouble, but that they could look to correct?
I think one of the things that we have seen most commonly is it starts with actually an awareness of exactly who are all the vendors on your page. So like we are talking about, this is, it is increasing in its scrutiny. And so step one tends to be, hey, do you actually know everything that is happening on your website? And it is the case that there are companies that actually don't know all the vendors that are on their website for, for a lot of reasons. Somebody else actually created the partnership and then that partnership was null, but the code still stayed on the page, that, things like that, it happens. Um, but the first step is just even understanding who are all the vendors. The second step is this issue that you talked about. Are you actually putting the right signal available to stop the sending of your personal data, or are you not? And so a lot of times what companies are doing is they tend to have a homegrown solution where it doesn't quite send the right signal for the vendors on the page to actually pick it up and then be able to downstream have those vendors know that this user is somebody who I cannot retarget or target on downstream pages, right? And doing that correctly and having auditability of that signal being sent to the vendors is, it tends to be more complex than initially anticipated. So a lot of companies that we work with now actually happen to be in the class of companies that they realized that, hey, we tried to do this ourselves. It turns out that is non-trivial. So can you help us make sure we're implementing the appropriate signaling, right? And then the last piece that you said is that it is the case even today, right now, that there are companies who they actually don't have a um, I would say, on the farthest side of the spectrum, they don't even have an email form. They have an email address that you can send inquiry for your data for a subject access request. We still see that in some places in the ecosystem, and I think that that's probably risky, right? Because not only is that very non-transparent as to what happens when I send an email to that email address, but then it's really unclear whether or not, I'll give you a simple example. What if I send an email to that email address and I pretended to be Justin, right? Do I have confidence that that company uh, is going to make sure that they're validating that I'm actually who I say I am? Because now you have a whole new risk, right? Of if you don't have a good process in place, then fulfilling the process actually becomes risky. So I think at every step of this journey, there is nuance you have to be thoughtful about. And there are companies that are doing it in the most basic way right now that it is going to be risky for them in the coming months. I think we're seeing that too. So
Yeah, no, I agree, Rishabh. And I think, what we've taken away from this is one of those problems that on the low hanging fruit side, solving it yourself is a lot of pain with not a lot of reward. And the chances that you're doing it right is low. Because for the very reason you just said, if what you're doing is taking a do not sell request right now, manually logging it and trying to get word out manually to stop practices that happen in real time, the chances that you're going to do that right in any way that you can prove it is just low. It just, the way the entire ecosystem works is kind of happening from the moment somebody visits your site. Um, so it is complex if you're trying to do it with a human being getting an email and trying to figure out and track it down. And believe me that when we've talked to the regulators, they say the same thing. It's very obvious if you go to somebody's website and they're a brand and they're doing targeting and retargeting. If they have an email that says, please opt me out of the sale of data, you've got a big red flag on your website that you're probably not doing the right thing. On the other hand, and this is where we've partnered on some phenomenal things just to build it in, we can stand up a pretty automated solution for the low hanging fruit where They have a branded experience. Somebody can say, do not sell. It actually operationalizes sending it out to the main platforms. You can do that quickly with the right infrastructure. But doing it manually is very hard to do if you're just sort of pasting it up. And the cost is not high for that, right? For that baseline. Where I see, and I, maybe I'll just show, like for me, it's something as simple as this, right? Being able to stand up a simple, this is a trust center that we built together with, LiveRamp, but being able to have a simple place, being able to click in, have a clear way that you can opt out of the sale of your data, and then also fill in additional information and have it operationalized and have the system automatically send out that persistent signal is a critical element that you just have to have. And it tells a story for you as a brand. But then you get into where things are going. And I know we're into our conversation here,
Yeah.
but what we've covered so far is just get the basics right. Make sure you know that you need to have something on your website as a brand that tells the story that you can do the right thing. Be aware, and maybe I'll just cover this briefly before we go into where this is going. Be aware that the world understands that brands, especially consumer brands, they understand that you're going to need to target and retarget as we come into the holiday season. Everybody knows that. And so if you're doing it, let's find a good way for you to do it ethically and tell that story clearly, because the regulators really, this is a thing they understand, right? That if you're if you're suddenly getting ads on all of the major platforms and you don't have a clear way to take that do not sell signal and operationalize it, you're kind of painting a target on your back, which we can help, could be addressed. But then where is this going, Rishabh? So we've talked about this, but third-party cookies are effectively, if I could simplify, you go to some company's website, it's a third party that's taking that signal. It's not that company. And that third party then kind of follows you around and, in simplified words, is enabling other companies to target you with the first company all over the web. And that's a thing that's become, an area of concern. So for our community, when we hear the phrases, hey, we're going to be moving away from third-party cookies to first-party cookies, what does that actually mean? What does it mean? And why is that better in any way? Maybe I start with that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So I think, first of all, I just want to echo, I think it's important to understand that right now is a really good opportunity to lay the foundation and the infrastructure. And I wanted to start with that because it is important for how we think about the future, right? The future doesn't become less complex unfortunately, it becomes more complex. That's just the nature of how things are. So, you know, if you're a brand or a publisher out there, I do recommend just thinking about how to lay that infrastructure the right way right now. So that way, as the third-party cookie gets deprecated, and there's other things like actually the Apple iOS 14 announcement with the the direct pop-up to the consumer, getting ahead of it with the right infrastructure is more likely to enable you to maintain more people in your database that are comfortable with you marketing and advertising to them. So I just want to echo what you were saying, Justin. The third-party cookie, if again, just illustratively, if we were to take this example of Criteo as a company that third-party cookies today, tomorrow what would happen is it's the brand itself. So it's the Gap, the Macy's, the New York Times website. It is their own cookie that will be still available on the page for that company to read. So what does this mean? Essentially what it means is that when I go from one website to another, there is no consistency in ID, right? So illustratively, if I'm on the Gap website, Gap knows who I am. When I'm on the New York Times website, the New York Times knows who I am. But to talk to each other all of a sudden becomes very difficult, right? And so now you have questions of, okay, so how do I effectively market and what types of data sharing will happen once you get out of a third-party cookie world. And essentially, what we will start to see is we will start to see more websites that you go to seeking a direct login or authentication from the consumer. So what that the New York Times is a great example, actually. The New York Times, when you go to their website today, they will very quickly ask you to log in with your email. And so it's an example of a publisher who is thinking ahead and trying to get a direct relationship with their consumer early and doing it now. And once they have the direct relationship with you, with your email address, there is a lot of proposals out there with independent agencies. So in the advertising world, we have this agency called the IAB. And so they have set out a framework to enable people to share data based off of essentially what is a hashed version of that email address. So again, trying to get to a place where you anonymize the actual person. So instead of, Rishabh at Gmail, which for the listeners out there is not my actual email address. So please don't email that email address. But so Rishabh at Gmail, they will, you hash it and then it just becomes some arbitrary ID that on the back end you can now share data based off of, right? So once you start sharing data based off of direct consumer interaction, this is where the infrastructure you have laid out early will help you. Because what you want to do is you want to make sure that the consumer understands that on a first party basis, so the website themselves and the consumer, you are setting up a relationship that you can actually use their data with your downstream partners and your downstream vendors. And so now that won't even happen on the page. Now that'll happen all on the back end. And so this is where I was saying, unfortunately, complexity increases because, if we thought third-party cookies was opaque, at least all of the cookies were happening on the page. Now all of this data sharing is going to happen on the back end, truly on the back end, on the what we call the server side. And so once you're in that world, then you have to be really thoughtful about maintaining the actual permissions that you have gathered for that data to be sent around and shared to your partners and vendors. So, you know, I I'll just sort of go back high level really quick to sort of, you know, get back to where we started. Once the third party cookie goes away, essentially what you're going to start to see is people are going to use these authentications and direct consumer relationships, and data sharing will still happen. And so that's what you should be prepared for.
Again, that's terrific, Rishabh. And we are coming up on time. We always run out of time in these discussions. Maybe I could ask this as a practical matter. And look, we've both covered that trying to build some of these and not having the core infrastructure means that it's hard to pivot. But the reason I phrase it that way is, what advice do you have for companies and for folks who are trying to get this right
Yeah.
in a world in which everything seems to shift every couple of months, not only from a legal regulatory perspective? So look, CCPA within 1 year went into effect. The regulations were revised, I think 5, 6 times. That's even before the law went into effect. Now CPRA comes out, it's going to go into effect. And in the middle of that, forget about the laws. You see, Apple making announcements on very kind of short notice about what that means. You see discussions of the deprecation of a third party cookie and how Google will be moving in that direction. It feels a little chaotic from a company perspective in terms of trying to make sure you're thinking even a little bit ahead of these issues. And you and I haven't even covered, and we won't have time for today, some of the major issues companies are facing, although maybe we can have you back and talk about this another time, Rashab, around multi-channel problem. I mean, if
Oh,
you look at the, I'm going to set this aside, but the multi-channel problem is from the consumer perspective, they interact with a brand in now 8, 10, whatever different ways, and they're having to give their preference on how to use their data in 8 different ways, which is not ideal if you're a human being walking the earth. So let's set aside that for a moment and maybe come back to it. How do companies, and what advice would you give for folks who are trying to do the right thing when the announcements come like this on very short notice? Like what can they be doing to think about that?
yeah, I think fundamentally, I would offer two pieces of advice that if you can, to set yourself up for sort of any announcement and any change that happens. The first is, I think the earlier you start to set up the right trusted engagement with your consumers, the better. So the sooner you have the infrastructure set up to get their appropriate permissions, to have the audit trail, to show them all the information in a good, concise, clear way that, hey, here is how we want to collect and use your data, the better. Because all of these rules and regulations, they tend to come from the same place, which is around transparency and choice, right? Ultimately they come from there. So the sooner you can set up a relationship with your consumer, and when I say set up a relationship with your consumer, I mean create the right interfaces and make sure that those interfaces are appropriate, the better off you are. The second thing I would say is that because the regulation is changing very quickly, and even when it is set, it is different in different geographies, and no company is, pure single geo anymore. It's very easy to be global these days, thankfully. And so I think the second thing you want to look for is you want to set up solutions and infrastructure that are flexible. You basically you want to get two things right. You want to get uh, configurability, meaning you want to partner with somebody who knows how to think about configurability. And the second is you want to get orchestration right. You want to work with somebody who knows how to do orchestration, because essentially configurability means I can now pivot quickly with whatever is changing in the ecosystem. And orchestration means I am working with somebody who is thoughtful enough to think about how to track the auditability and the proof if and when that happens, right? And so those are the two pieces of advice I would give to people is do it early and set up that relationship with your consumer in the right way. And then the second is focus on configurability and orchestration when you're setting up your solution.
Rashab, that was once again terrific, and I agree with you totally. The basic infrastructure is is totally manageable. I mean, the basic solutions, and if you build some flexibility where you can do what you need to do without having a ton of engineering work, and you have some flexibility to push the signals or like manage it, you can actually tackle things extremely quickly. Um, and and so, look, we have come a little bit to the end of today's discussion, but if I stand back, here's some of my takeaways, and maybe you can give a few from your side too, Rashab. Uh, One is there's low hanging fruit. There's very simple things that customers and companies should be doing to make sure you are sending a clear signal to potential customers and your actual customers that you're doing the right thing here when it comes to targeted advertising. You should absolutely have some core messaging on your website that says it in a way a human being can understand it. You should have some basic infrastructure that makes clear that you can both take the signals and pass them on the right way, because if unless you're a brand that is not targeting and retargeting, which seems rare at this point, if you're a brand that's doing that, you want to have it clear on your website that you're doing this in a more automated way, because it's just so clear that you can't do this totally manually. And third, there are some good ways in a cost efficient way that matches what you're doing to make sure you build in some flexibility into your approach so that if something changes, you have a way to pivot and make sure you can comply in the right way. And if I'm thinking about brands coming into the holiday season, who are thinking about making sure they can do this the right way, those are my three takeaways. There is a path, there can be cost efficiency, you can build some flexibility in the system, but make sure you do something because it's a big red flag if you're a brand and your website says, click here and send an email, to make sure you're doing it right. So anyway, I'll turn it back to you, and maybe you can think big picture a little bit about where this is going or takeaway wise.
Yeah, no, I mean, first of all, I couldn't agree more with the sort of three things that you said as the big takeaways around, there are essentially things that you can do today and you should do them today. I think for me, one of the big takeaways from today's discussion is I think it's pretty clear what consumers want. And so, you know, California, I mean, it's voters who voted for CCPA. It's people. It's not some legislation. It's not some legislators, in a room somewhere who came up with this. It's a proposition, and so it's people in California who said we want this, and then they said we want it again. And so when people are telling you what they want, my sort of way of thinking about this is when people are telling you what they want, it tends to mean that they want it. And if you give them, and if you show that you're listening, and you show that you're listening sooner rather than later, they will trust you more. And so my big takeaway from CCPA, CPRA, Apple, all of these announcements that keep happening is that it's pretty clear what consumer expectations are going to be moving forward. And if you set up correctly today, you are more likely to maintain and gain the trust of your consumers in the future. That's really my big takeaway from today's discussion and the legislations that we've been seeing.
That was a perfect way to wrap up. Rishabh, thank you so much for joining us today on our webinar. I thought it was a terrific discussion, and I think it's going to be incredibly helpful to the whole community here, really. I hope you'll join me again to talk about how we can help on these sides.
I'd love to. And thank you again, Justin. It was a pleasure speaking with you as always.
Terrific. We'll see you soon.
Have a good one, everyone.
Be safe.